In the early 90s, Final Fight was ported from the arcade to the Super Nintendo. Then in 1993, it was ported to the Sega CD as Final Fight CD. Both of these games were developed by Capcom. So, what's the difference? Most of the differences between these games stem from the fact that the Sega CD game is just like the arcade. I'm going to say just like the arcade a lot, so drinking game? The first difference you might notice is that you can be all three characters, just like the arcade. That was quick. You're not just limited to Cody and Hagar like on the Super Nintendo, or Guy and Hagar like in Final Fight Guy, but we're not talking about that game. Another big difference is that Final Fight CD is actually 2 players, just like the arcade. The Super Nintendo game is just 1 player. The Sega CD game has the industrial level and Rolento boss fight, just like the arcade. Both were completely absent from the Super Nintendo game. The Sega CD game also has Roxy and Poison, just like the arcade. They were replaced by Sid and Billy in the Super Nintendo game, as hitting ladies was too raunchy for the Super Nintendo. But the Sega CD game did have some censorship. Roxy and Poison have longer shirts and pants when compared to the arcade. Also, Damned and Sodom were renamed Thrasher and Katana, just like the Super Nintendo game. No. And no booze for health. Both games completely replaced them. Another difference is that the Sega CD game has transitions between levels, just like the arcade. The Super Nintendo game just goes black. Another difference is the number of enemies on screen. The Super Nintendo game can only have 3, while the Sega CD game can have 4. And when you use a continue on Sega CD, you start right where you died from, just like the arcade. On Super Nintendo, you have to start all the way from the beginning of the stage. This makes the game so much harder. And when you die on Sega CD, the enemies fall and lose life when you respawn, just like the arcade. It doesn't happen on the Super Nintendo game. The Sega CD also has smoother character animations. All the characters have more frames of animation too. The music in both games is slightly different. They're the same songs, but they're arranged differently. The Sega CD game sounds mostly like the arcade. The Sega CD sounds like real instruments, while the Super Nintendo is more limited. Sound effects in both games are different too. And Hagar definitely sounds better on Sega CD. The Sega CD does have things that the arcade doesn't. The Sega CD game has a time attack mode. It's a mode where you beat up as many enemies as you can in a certain amount of time. It's pretty simple, but it does have some new backgrounds for us to look at, which is a nice touch. More areas of Metro City. The Super Nintendo game doesn't have this mode. Also, the Sega CD game does one better than even the arcade by having voiceovers in the cutscenes.
What? What happened to Jessica?
Even the mouths move when they speak.
Guy, Jessica was kidnapped.
Jessica?
It's not the best voice acting, but it's a nice addition. The Super Nintendo game uses text, just like the arcade. Yeah, sure. So, is it worth it? Definitely. The Sega CD is the better version of the game, hands down. It's almost a perfect port of the arcade game. Having all 3 characters in 2-player mode alone makes it better than the Super Nintendo game. And all the other additions are really nice bonuses. The only real downside is that it can be a bit pricey, especially compared to the Super Nintendo game. And since the arcade game is available for cheaper too, it's hard to justify spending so much. But if you have some extra cash on you, definitely give Final Fight CD a go.